generally the same design, didn't really change all that much. And what we're going to do is have the ability to add what we would call, I don't know, items, right, to the list below it. There was some stuff in the workshop, and then this can be implemented to have some business logic that says, hey, look, you can't add, you know, you can only add one hotel, you know, and that sort of thing. And that's something that you could work on when we end up persisting this, because I think you'll have some time to do it. I think out of the three, this is by far the trickiest workshop to do. And what I want to try to do is sort of break it down, because I think a lot of people had mentioned that they sort of felt like they were getting, they were going towards spaghetti code with this, and it's not uncommon. And let's try to think of ways that we could think about stuff up front. So as we're doing it, maybe we could even think, hey, look, can we build this in a way, we don't have to write tests on it, right? But we could. And as we build it, let's think, could something like this be sort of easily testable? Testing out these methods or some of these methods on these objects and that sort of thing. So we'll think about it from that perspective. Now, there were some things that were not in the workshop that I put in that make this even a little bit more complicated. Things like filters from the drop-down list so that you can't add it twice. Again, and this could be a business logic that makes sense, maybe not. When you end up putting it back, that's not good. So you could add days, add events. I'm gonna have to figure out why my remove isn't working. This is what happens when you end up doing a late, this is invariably what happens when you do a late game refactor. So we'll figure out why that is. Hopefully there's an error sum here, which I've got a context issue, which I'll end up fixing. But so that we're going to have that functionality. If for some reason someone removes all the days, you know, you don't get any errors when you're attempting to add things. Things in terms of so you have to add a day before you could end up adding items. And we've got, you know, situations where if we add a day and we end up, you know, switching days, our mapping works. One thing that I did here is I kept that one, what I'm calling sort of my permanent marker on here for all the full stack marker that sort of starts out with the app. So that's what we're gonna build towards here. I wanna make a couple of modifications here. So right now, this is not even running. And let's actually go and start this up. So this is going to be, get into the right directory. Okay, so also just to sort of show you a couple things, this was, I think, it ended up being a little bit confusing and something that I should have explained a little bit more. So the project that you downloaded, in the package JSON file, there was actually a couple of different tasks. I mean, we spoke about some of these before. There's a reason why I have this as a start dev task. And one thing that I want you to start doing with your project is start to deploy this. Think about deploying, and we'll go through how you end up deploying something, but pretty much nothing. You end up, what ends up happening as a default, if your application is, if you're deploying to someplace that hosts node applications, what it'll end up doing, it'll automatically end up running an npm install, okay? And then after everything's installed, it'll end up running npm start. So if this was in a production environment, right, I would just want it to run my node server. And you could ask, well, what about my connection variables and all that stuff? If it's a live application, you're not going to want to put your connection information on GitHub. You're just going to want to set it up. Whatever your hosting environment is going to give you the ability to create your environment variables. When I'm running things locally, I have, I'm doing start dev, which also is running my SAS files. I had some problems with the node SAS, and as a result of that, I'm doing mine in a gulp task, which is fairly easy to understand here. And let's just take a look at it because we're going to have to modify it too. So gulp is basically going to allow, gulp is used a lot for a number of different things. You can actually start, your development environment with it, kick off processes with it, but very often it ends up getting used to transform your files. So in other words, if you have to have CoffeeScript files that you're going to transform to JavaScript, or you're going to have SAS files or less files that you're going to end up transforming to CSS, you might want to use it. And there's we'll look at this briefly. I want to just sort of expose you to it. You could read up on Gulp a little bit, but what this is basically doing, if we start out by looking at this SAS task, what this does is that Gulp has this source method. And the source method, when we talk about Gulp, we say that Gulp is stream-based. So it reads as piping one stream into the next stream. So when we say gulp.source, and I'm defining this pattern, what's going to happen is it's going to create a stream with all the files that match that pattern, right? So those would be all the SAS files in my project. And then what I'm doing is I'm then I actually copied this right from this gulp SAS npm. You'll get a SAS error if there's an error, but the most important thing is that it's going to pipe after it ends up operating, running the SAS on it. It's going to end up putting it to the destination folder, which is public and style sheets. We're going to change that folder. That's actually not the folder that I want to use for our client-side code. We're going to have two folders for our client-side code. We're going to have vendor, which are going to be things that we don't write, things that would end up getting installed with Bower install. And we're going to have another folder, which we're going to call client, which is going to be our JavaScript and our CSS, so we separate things out a little bit better. So it's really clear as to what's our code and what is vendor code. The same way that we don't end up putting our client-side code inside of the node modules folder. We could, but it really doesn't make any sense to do that. And you don't even want to include that folder in your GitHub repository. So
is that task returning promise?
Is this task returning a promise? I don't know if it's returning a promise, but it is actually this. Let's look at it in context of the task that's below it. So the task that's below it, what we're saying here is kind of an interesting thing. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. That's actually the task that we're running. So when we run SAS watch, in answer to your question, almost positive it is returning a promise. Okay?
So Gulp allows you to return a promise and then it terminates.
What Gulp does, so what this actually does, when you read this, what it says is I'm creating a task, and you can name it whatever you want to, totally arbitrary. I'm naming before it ends up running, okay, you could put dependent tasks in the next parameter. You might not have any dependent tasks. But what I'm saying here is that, hey, look, before I start running this task, forget about what's in this task. Before I make it in here, I want to run this task SAS, and I want it to complete before I go into this callback. Okay? And that's why you end up returning a promise here. So what ends up happening in that SAS task is that it creates all my CSS files. Okay? Now what I want to do is that what I'm actually doing here, Gulp has the ability to watch. And so what I'm doing is I'm watching any files that match my pattern. If I end up adding a new SAS file, so it runs it first, and then it watches it, and it'll end up running that SAS again. So you'll end up, these Gulp can get a bit complicated. Theoretically, you should be able to do all this stuff with it and as well, but it definitely reads a little bit better, and it's more maintainable in a Gulp file. Now let's talk about there's actually one other thing that I wanted to run here. And this is kind of buggy. Some people ran into this, some people didn't, but if I ended up going into my DB file, I made a little bit of a mistake here. And that mistake was when I call my connect, which is up here, this is actually incorrect, the way that I called this. So what ends up happening, when you end up doing Mongoose Connect, and you connect with Mongoose, that callback will always get executed, okay? If it's able to connect, then it'll end up getting executed without an error. So there's a parameter that'll get sent here. Again, this callback function gets called either if I was able to connect or I wasn't able to connect, or if there was an error. If there is an error, you'll get an error parameter. So one thing we probably want to do here is if in fact there is an error, someone had asked me too about handling reject for this, which we probably should do. We're going to turn reject, and we could reject with that error. So in which case, the way that our server is set up, if we're not able to connect to Mongoose, why bother going on? And also notice, again, there's that whole idea of getting out of there with that return. Also in here too, I'd rather do the return. To me, it just feels a little bit better. And my code, it becomes a little bit less cluttered. So that's one change that I want to make here. And if I end up making that change, I could end up starting my app, npm. And again, if it's not a standard package JSON file, you have to do npm run, and I think it was start dev. All right, so this is going to run, and this is going to be our starting point. Okay. Now, let's actually start a couple of things that I want to do. Is I want to move this public right now has my style sheets in it. I don't have any client-side JavaScript files, but I don't want these things going together. These two things that are here are really vendor files. These style sheets are my files, okay? So what I want to be able to do here is I'm going to move a couple things around. And I'm going to create a folder called client. And I'm going to go over here to my public, and I'm going to move this. And I'm going to move this into, instead of public, this is going to be client, right? This is my code. This is the stuff that I wrote. So now I've got client. I've got my style sheets here. I also want to rename this. If we actually wanted to take this one step at a time, we could actually go back to my app file and keep this public here for the moment, but we could actually say we're going to have something called client. We'll end up going to client. And if we're going to end up doing that, then let's also modify our gulp so that our assets are the same, but when we output this, let's output this to client. And if I go and I kill my process, and I run this again, I go back and reload this. And let me actually open up my code here on the side. So one of the things that's probably going to happen here is that it's not loading. I have to change the reference to my style sheet, which is in my layout file. So if I go back here, go to views and layout, and this is going to be a link not to public, but to client. And you reload that, right? That error should go away. And so the next thing that I want to do is that I want to also rename this. Instead of public, let's call it vendor, okay? Because these are really vendor files. Now, I had mentioned before, one of the things we could always do here, okay? I could always go in here and I can get rid of this directory totally, okay? Because again, this should be the same. You should never be concerned about wiping out your node modules folder or whatever your Bower folder is, okay? In fact, you should never worry about it because in your repository, they shouldn't even be in your repository, okay? So I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna wipe this out. I'm gonna modify one thing here. And let me kill this. And I'm going to go into my Bower RC file. Bower. Okay, that looks like this. And I'm going to change this to vendor. Now let's actually just make sure that we have a, and we might not have it, but let's see if we have it. One of the things we don't have here, at least I don't see it, is we don't have our Bower file, okay? So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say Bower init. And we'll take a look also what this looks like. So this basically is going to give me a file that looks like this, our JSON file, okay? Don't have any modules in here at the moment. It sort of ignores certain folders here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say Bower install, and I'll say bootstrap jQuery save. Same way that you have your npm file, you could end up using Bower. And so if I go back in here, I'll see that now I've got these dependencies that are here. And if I go back over here, I'll see that I have my vendor folder, and here's my bootstrap and my jQuery. So I really want to make a distinction between, again, the vendor file is my node modules for my client, okay? Granted, as an aside, you could also do npm install bootstrap, which will install it in the node modules folder, which is fine too. You can do that as well, okay? Two different ways to sort of get the same thing. But if you did want to separate out your client-side code specifically and not put it in your node modules folder, you could end up using Bower. And so now, once I do that, let me actually go in and modify my view so that, you know, and actually two things, right? Let's go over here, and our static route, I'm going to call this vendor. And I'll call this vendor. And these are going to be for my bootstrap files and my jQuery files. So if I go up here to layout, here's my jQuery. It's actually going to be in vendor. And this is going to be in vendor. The client side, I've got my vendor files and I've got my client files. Now, if we end up loading this, we have to start it. npm run start dev. Okay.
And quick question again, how would you handle when you get your Bower folder and your node modules folder? Would you just leave them as they are and have two separate static routes if you wanted to keep those, or because if you want Bower to automatically fill your dependencies and npm to automatically fill your dependencies, you're going to end up with two folders, right?
Yeah, tell me what you mean when you say automatically fill my
So
dependencies.
like, you pass the project off to someone else and then they do Bower install,
Right.
npm install.
Sure.
It creates and fills those two folders.
That's correct.
So now you have two folders. I mean, obviously you can manually drag them both down to vendor, but like what's best practice when you're using npm and
You know, it all depends. You know, it's a good question. I mean, look, I think that there was some, even in this workshop, there was a question, and I had told you folks, I said, and people brought this up. They said, hey, look, if you do a static route of your node modules folder, can't people sort of go in and figure out if that's a static route? Because static routes, you're exposing everything, right? So if your node modules folder, right, but some would say, hey, look, you know, if there is, you don't want to give away any more information than you have to. Client-side stuff you're giving away. Absolutely, if it's on the client side, people are accessing it, okay? Server-side stuff, so you could say, hey, look, you know, maybe there's a vulnerability in some node package. And so someone goes around, they could say, hey, look at this. He's got a way for me to query go in and let me see if this file exists. Then I know they're probably using it, then I could expose it. So people had said to me, hey, look, if you put your bootstrap under the node modules folder and you end up setting up a static route because that's how you serve your client-side code, theoretically, there's a little bit of a vulnerability. So if that vulnerability is something that you're concerned about, then I would say use Bower and install things with Bower. I think that's the easiest way to do it. And then when someone goes and gets your project or you're working with someone, you know, you don't end up putting what in our case would be our vendor folder wouldn't go into our repository. Our node modules folder wouldn't go in our repository, and we'd have a README file that said, hey, look, get this, start up your Mongo database, run npm install, run Bower install, and if you're running, you know, run npm start dev server, whatever it is that we called it. So again, I think it's a question of if that's a concern with security, and I think it's valid. I think it's a valid concern. I think Bower might fit the bill. You might be able to get that same effect with npm install, but offhand, I don't know exactly how you would do that. So, I mean, you could also, if you wanted to, you could always set up static routes for your individual things, but I think you're going down a path that you probably don't want to go down. And at some point, I think in a production environment, you're going to get your files and minify them all anyway. So it's a whole other ball of wax. So once we end up having this, we could start thinking about how we're going to end up setting up our application. So one thing that I want to do here is that there's always a question of really where do you start with this? And we've got our client files. We know that the place that we're interested in is going to be index. Now, right now in index, we've got all this code that's here. It's a little bit ugly to look at. So let's actually move some of this out so we don't have this code sitting inside of our HTML. What we can do here is we could take this code. It's actually also not a bad practice to be in. Right, I could see the changes that I made here. And again, I moved a bunch of things around. And I'll say re-architect. Okay. So let's actually think about what we could do here. One thing that might make sense to do is to go into our client folder. And let's specify, because in our client folder, we could have CSS. We could also have JavaScript. So let's create a folder called JavaScript. And let's create a file called map. And this is going to be our Google Maps code. And let's go back here to our views and our index and just move this code that's here and we'll move this into our map. Okay? Now, if we want to end up utilizing this code, then let's go into our index file. And here's our Google Maps. And you might ask, hey, how come you're not putting this on the layout page? Well, this is specific to this index page. So we could go over here, and this is going to be script, source, and this is going to be client, JavaScript, map.js. So if we do that, we can run this and we should still be in good shape. Okay. Let's also go and let's move this out so that we're not embedding our start because we might want to do other things. This is really, if you look at this, and I mentioned this before, there's a couple different ways to do this. So what is happening here is that we're using the $sign to wrap around the document, and you could do that, and you could then say, hey, look, when my document is ready, remember I told you there's a fourth way you could use a $sign and pass a function in there? We'll get the exact same results. I think this does the exact same thing in doing that. Now, if we run this, we'll have the same thing. Things work exactly the same. Let's actually move this code. Let's create a file called app. So this is going to be sort of our starting point for our client-side code. And I'm going to move this stuff in here. Again, if I go to run this, there's no breaking change, but my map is just not going to end up showing up. So we could go back in here and we could specify, and this is going to be client app.js. Now you can ask the question, hey, look, does that order matter here? Is our app going to be calling a function that's in that map file? It is, but don't forget, we have a callback in our app file. We're saying that, look, jQuery, don't run this callback. Don't run this callback until everything is loaded in the DOM, right? Including my script files. So you don't really have any that's here. By the way, as we do this, we're going to realize, hey, look, we're going to have to think about some dependencies when things load. This is one of the things that frameworks like Angular take care of for us, where there's one file that's important, but other than that, the order is going to be meaningless. So we'll learn about that.
So, on client side, if you put a script in for JavaScript, basically everything you define in functions are in the global namespace, basically?
That's correct.
Okay.
And that's not great, and we're going to try to avoid that. And we'll talk about how we're going to sort of bootstrap our application up in order to avoid that, okay? And I'm going to try to leave the map file alone for the moment, but we'll talk about how we're going to end up setting things up. So if we go over here, we should get our map back. And our map comes back. That's a good sign. Now, what I actually want to do here, in the end, I want to do something like this. Again, I'm going to leave this initialize global map file. But what I want to be able to do is to pass some function to this. Because really, and I don't know if you guys ran into this at all, but you can't start adding markers to maps and that sort of thing until your map has finished loading, okay? This process of our map loading, it's asynchronous, right? It's going up to Google, it's getting information to end up drawing the map. So, is to pass function in here, have some kind of callback. Again, I don't want to change everything, but I want to make some modifications here. And let's just do a console.log. Map is loaded. Go back here. Not going to see that call, but if we end up going to our, well, actually, I kind of screwed up. I want to put this, I'm going to move this. It should actually be in our JavaScript folder too. And once that's in here, let's just go back to our index and just fix that. A bit strange. client JavaScript. Okay. So that's saved, and we go back here. And client.
I think you might have tried to put it in the JavaScript folder, not the client JavaScript folder.
Oh, okay. Is there? All right. Thank you. So this is going to be client JavaScript. And that should be good. And if we reload this, we should be in business. Now, let's actually get that callback to work. So if we end up going over to our map, we're just specifying that we have this callback that we're passing in here. And what we're going to do here is that I'm going to call that callback, and I'm going to call it with the map, right? So in other words, that map is going to end up getting created, and I'm going to call that with the map. If I end up reloading this, I should at least see that message that my map ended up reloading, okay? I also want to point something else out here. This is a little bit subtle, but you'll notice that every time that I end up changing a file here, so here's my MongoD, here's my server. I'm going to clear this. If I end up going and I change a file, even this map file, the server restarts. There's no reason for my server to restart when I change a client-side file, right? And when I change a server file, I want it to restart. By default, what ends up happening is that your process ends up restarting every time NodeMon basically says, I don't really care what changes, I'm going to restart things. Now, we could run things without NodeMon, which would be fine. But another thing you could also do is that you could go into your package JSON file. And when we end up starting dev, there's a flag that we could pass into NodeMon and tell it to ignore some files. So we could go and say, we want you to ignore. And what do we want you to ignore? We want you to ignore under client JavaScript if we make changes to our client-side code, right, it's not going to restart. So if I go back over here now, you can see it just restarted again. But now if I end up running my npm run start dev, and I go back here and I end up changing my app file, like we know my app file now, I'm telling you that we're actually sending the map back. You'll see that it doesn't end up restarting, which is good, okay? I don't know if you guys ran into that issue or if you're running NodeMon for this. You didn't really have to change any client. It was a little bit less of an issue, but usually it's going to have no impact on things. It just slows things down.
So how does the client get that updated code?
I'm going to ask you, how's the client going to get the updated code?
When you refresh the browser
That's correct.
and it gets the updated, like everything else is updated?
Well, I mean, the browser has no idea about the server just returns whatever it returns, right? So your JavaScript is going to end up reloading by your browser reloading. And that's why, by the way, it is actually an interesting question, because when you say, how does your client know about it? There are packages that will automatically, we looked at this way back, we looked at something called browser sync. There's something also called live reload, where those packages would look at your client-side code and automatically just refresh your browser. And I know that seems like it's kind of silly, but when you're developing all day, those small things end up making a big difference. You know, it's like the brownies from yesterday. Small thing, but it was a huge difference for the day, right? So here, if we do that, I can see that I'm actually getting my map back here, Okay. Now, there's two things that I really want to get from my map. I'm just sort of thinking ahead a little bit. That I would like to get not only my map, but I would also like to have this marker as well. I'm going to sort of use this as my marker that doesn't end up getting removed at all. And again, that's not really going to change anything all that much. If I went back here, I could just say, here's my map and my marker. Okay, now we're sort of ready to start looking at creating this trip. Now, what I like to do is I like to have, if I could think of a way to sort of have some reusability right off the bat, what I want to do is have a way of saying, thinking about what this thing is like the map, the combination of the selectors on the top, the combination of the thing on the bottom. What is that whole thing? To me, it's a trip planner, right? So what I want to be able to do on the client side is to instantiate a trip planner. And I could even do something kind of interesting. You could say, hey, look, imagine that your itinerary from your trip planner was coming from the server, right? You could actually make, we're not doing it here, but we can make an AJAX call to the server, and we could end up getting our itinerary, okay? And we could end up, when we get our itinerary, then we could end up starting our trip planner, loading our trip planner. So what I want to do here doesn't exist yet. What I want to be able to do when my app ends up starting, unbelievable, already this morning. You guys got an extra hour of sleep. Unreal. So what I want to be able to do here is that I would like to be able to create a new trip planner. And what I'm going to pass to that trip planner, now I don't have any data right now, but it's sort of a placeholder where we do have some data. And you could also imagine, this is kind of nice because let's say that I did have an itinerary. You could imagine, hey, here's an object that I could pass some data to that I then have the ability to maybe write some tests on as well. Okay? So what am I going to pass to my trip planner? I'm going to pass my map. I'm going to pass my marker. Okay? And I'm going to throw a third thing in here. I'm not crazy about global variables, but I'm going to throw a third thing in here, which is my attractions. My attractions are going to be my hotels, all of them, all of my hotels, all of my restaurants, okay, and all of my activities, okay? Now, obviously, I have two problems here. I don't have a trip planner, and I don't have attractions, okay? So let's fix that. What we're going to do is we're going to create the first thing, let's take care of the attractions. And this is actually a pretty easy fix. If we end up going to our views and we look at our index, in fact, I think it might be in our case, oh, actually, no, it's not here yet. This is something that we're adding for this, right? So this is not something we have at the moment. This is something that we're going to need to add. So we can actually put this right on our page, right? We know that on our index page, I mean, we can see this when we end up using our selectors, that we've got our hotels, we've got our restaurants, and we've got our activities, right? This is all server-side code. But one of the things that I could do here is on my index page, perfectly legitimate, put a script here. And this is part of the workshop too. And to specify attractions, this is global at the moment. There's no way to really avoid that. But I'm going to say hotels, hotels, restaurants, restaurants. And this is going to be activities, activities.
You need a column.
Thank you.
What's the difference between doing this and passing these objects through result.render.
Well, result.render, don't forget, result.render, I can only get, that would be a single request, right? That's how you would end up getting this data from an AJAX request. But when you render, you can only render one thing at a time, right? Now, by the way, this is actually...
So the page doesn't have access to all the objects. It's just,
So
unless you do this.
So let's be clear about something. Now, this is, I'm gonna have to make a change here. This is not right, okay? Because in fact, when this runs, this script tag is running on the client, okay? When the client looks at this, it's gonna say, okay, hotels equals hotels. And JavaScript's a little bit weird. That it doesn't know about, it throws an error. I don't know what hotels is. I don't know what you're talking about, right? What I really wanna do is I wanna specify, I wanna go over here, and I want to use my swig. Again, all of this gets transformed with swig before it goes to the client. When it gets to the client, I should have my restaurants, and I should have my activities.
You need that type, JSON?
I don't know. I was actually, it's a good question. I was actually just thinking about this. I wasn't positive what the answer is. I might. I think I might. And I think, yeah. So one of the things that happens here, I remember getting this error. Last time I was sort of going to go through this workshop, and it was a like weekend, and I was freaking out, and I texted, I slacked Gabe, you know, what's going on. And while I was waiting for his response, I realized that what happens here is that it's just, what it's trying to do is spit out a visual representation of and it doesn't quite know how to do it. So what you're forced to do, there's something that it's looking at. Again, these objects, this is a collection of instances that we've gotten from Mongoose, right? What we really want to do is we want to take this data and convert it to JSON. Use that filter. And now it'll give us just the JSON representation of those objects. Now we still have this problem that Tripplaner is not defined, but let's actually just take a look and see what our source code looks like here. View.
So in what instance would you use that JSON type?
Whenever you're outputting data from the server to the client. And that doesn't quite look right. Let me just see if I'm missing something here. So this is our I think that actually should be okay. Let me see what it looks like here. Yeah, no, it doesn't look right. Let me just see what I'm missing here. Yeah, this error, I think, has to do with
I think they set up independent variables.
oh, I know what I'm sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I realized what it is. So what happens is that if you, that was the, they did set up independent variables, but there's actually one thing that I forgot to do. So there's some setting where it'll go and escape characters for you. So you're not doing something, inserting something that you don't want to insert in your page. And what I forgot to put in here was this auto escape false. And yeah. So that's something, and you'll see that in a lot of the templating engines. There's some sort of built-in safety checks here. So you're saying, hey, look, it's my stuff. I know it's good. I'm going to output it. And so now the only error that we get is that Tripplaner is not defined. So let's actually start setting up our Tripplaner. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create a file, Tripplaner, and this is going to be a constructor. And we are passing into Tripplaner. We're passing in our days, a map, a marker, and attractions. Okay? So now we just need to go and modify our index file. And we could go over here. And this is going to be JavaScript Tripplaner. And I'm not seeing any errors. That's a good sign. Okay. So now really most of my work could be focused on what's happening in here. And this is really the only file that I'm really going to need to work with. And what we're going to do here, since we are instantiating this Tripplaner, we're going to go over here and we could say this dot days equals days. This dot map equals map. For the moment, we'll say this dot marker equals marker. We're not going to do much with it yet, but we eventually will. And we'll say this dot attractions equals attractions. So is everyone comfortable with what all these things are that we're passing in here? Does everyone sort of realize that that's really all our Tripplaner needs? It needs a map. I want a default marker, right? Because I want to keep that there when I end up switching between days. I want attractions because I want to be able to, you have this whole idea that when you select something from the drop-down list on the top, you have an ID, right? And you want to be able to find the information about that, and that you can end up getting from the attractions. So I know that this was, and the workshop sort of approached this by sort of starting by adding the events, but let's do things a little bit differently. Let's actually start with the days. Because instead of actually having to sort of go backwards, which is not uncommon, it's not a workflow where you go, all right, I got this working for one day, let me add multiple day support. Let's think about how the multiple day support is going to end up working. So we're going to have this functionality here. And let's actually just do something and specify that, you know, if you come in here, we can't really do much for you if you end up coming in here and you don't have any days, right? So let's actually, now again, we could think ahead. Hey, look, maybe if our data was coming from a database, we'd be coming in here with some data, okay? But let's assume that we don't have any data at the moment. And since we don't have any data at the moment, let's say, hey, look, you know what? If this dot days is equal to days dot length equal to 0, okay? Let's say this dot, and we'll add a day over here, right? So we're basically going to have some method to go and add a day. And what we'll end up doing when we want to add a day is we could actually set this up to say Tripplaner prototype, right? This is something a Tripplaner is going to be able to do. We want it to be able to add a day. And whenever we add a days, and we know we want this functionality anyway, whenever we add a day, simply we're going to go in here and we're going to say this days dot push. And what are we going to push to it? Hotels, restaurants, and activities.
Only one hotel.
Huh?
Only one hotel.
That's true. But let's do, we'll add multiple hotels. Then this is something that we can this will be business logic that you could change on the next one.
One way I was thinking that, I ended up not using it along this manner, I was thinking also a day could be a, constructive function.
John, it's a,
Simple array. You create a new day with all your goodies on it.
John, you're right. You're right. We could have a day and we could sort of break that apart, and that could be something that we end up doing. In fact, the last time that I did this, I had a lot of these objects, an object for a trip, an object for days, but for now, let's simplify it. If we end up needing it, we'll end up putting it back in. The other thing that might be handy for us is that if you ended up adding this day, we know we're going to get to our days based on an index, right? So it'd be nice if, in fact, we end up returning from this day's dot length -1. And this would be the index of the day that we just ended up adding. Could end up coming in handy, okay? The other thing we could also do here is that we're going to also want to keep track of the current index of what day we're on, right? So another thing we might want to do here is have this property, which is going to be called current IDX, and we'll set this to 0. So again, we're not focusing, let's just focus on the days that we end up having in our application. We've got these, we're going to have this array of days, and we're going to want to keep track of which day that we're on. So in fact, once we end up doing this, what we can end up doing is we could end up specifying that we're going to do something like this. Render day picker. And end up passing this in here to render our days. So our day picker is going to be a collection of links for our days. Now, right now, this function doesn't exist. Let's start to set it up. The nice thing about this setup, too, is that there's nothing that would prevent us, just for kicks, doesn't hurt, add another day. Have 2 days to start out with. We could always comment it out, okay? But let's go in here and let's actually create a method. How many people used prototype objects for their solution? You should have. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't either. I didn't either when I started. I went back and refactored this and thought about it. And again, just sort of thinking about this as you do. Again, there's not a lot that we're doing here, but we do have something that we could sort of think about that we have in this black box that we could test out if we wanted to test out. There's nothing here that looks all that complicated, right? I mean, we've got this object that's wrapping around a map, a marker. Yeah, the map is a bit complicated. The marker is a bit complicated, okay? But again, we could stub out those things if we wanted to at some point. So when we go to render the day picker, okay, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to basically loop over each of our days, right? So if we think about our day picker here, let's actually first, what I always like to do here is find my day picker. So if I go over here, I look on my views, and I think this is in my trip. My trip has this nav. I'm going to call this day picker. My thing is always to go and make sure I could find it before I do anything else. And I'll say this dot day picker, excuse me, $, pound, day picker, hide. Make sure I was able to find it, right? Very often you'll end up, and this should go away when I refresh, assuming I don't have any other errors. Render day picker doesn't exist. Tripplaner, I think I left out an N. Now, that should go away, okay? So you want to make sure you could find something. And what I'm going to do with my days is that I'm going to, that was silly. How about hide slow? Neat. See, that map was actually probably, that map loading was putting some pressure on the JavaScript. That's probably why that looked a little bit strange. And so what I'm going to do now with this code is that I'm going to want to generate or render this date picker. So if we think about it, we could start off by doing something like this, right? We've got our days, and what we could end up doing is we could take our days, do a for each on it, and simply we could do something like we're going to have a link, $A, and we're going to want that link to have an HTML. So when we end up looping over something, right, we'll end up getting our day. The other thing we could also get is the index of the day. So again, we don't want this to be 0. We'd like it to be 1. So here's my link. And then I could create a list item. And this could be my list item. And I could append to it my link. And then I could take my date picker. And I could append to it my list item. Pretty good, right? So, not quite right? I've got this stuff here. So one thing that I probably want to do here, every time that I end up going in here to render my date picker, I probably want to tell my date picker, empty itself. One thing a jQuery object can do is empty itself. And
Is that different from remove?
yeah, I don't want to remove the date picker. Removing it would remove the element itself. Empty removes what's inside of it.
Right, just we were doing space li remove, which is the same, I guess. Removing all the
That would remove all the list items, but right. So here I've got my 2 days, okay? It would also be nice if I can pre-select the day that should be selected, right? So if I go in here, I could say, I could loop over this and I could say, hey, look, if the index is equal to this current IDX, then what I'm going to say is I'm going to say list item, add class, active.
What's
Right.
the current IDX there?
Planner. And one of the things that I've set up here is my current index. Okay, I could set it to something else if I want to, okay? But I just want to throw this out at you. And I don't know if you ran into this, but what do you think? Anyone see a problem here? I don't need to do it yet, okay? Because I'm re-rendering the list every time, okay? Anything else? Huh?
It's defined in the for.
Yeah, it's defined. What for each actually gives you the item and you're looping over in the index of that.
Oh, this might be an issue there. 'Cause it's
Right.
For each.
For each loop has its own context, right? So what you can do is that you could actually take a for each has a parameter that you could send it that says, hey, look, I want my context when this gets called to be this. Okay? If you didn't want to do that, lazy man's way, that equals this, and you can put that in there. But once I end up doing that, I should see that this is going to be pre-selected. And if I wanted this to be 2, right, just for kicks, then the second one is going to be selected, okay? The next thing that I want to do is I would like to actually be able to, how about adding days and removing days would also be nice to do. The other thing that we know is that when we end up rendering our day picker, right? So when our day picker ends up getting rendered, the other thing that we would like to do is we would actually like to be able to render whatever is inside the day as well, right? So we don't necessarily have to do that here, but at least we could sort of get ready for it by saying this dot render day. And again, I can say to my trip planner, you're going to have a prototype called render day. And for now, I'll just do a placeholder console.log, render day for plus this current IDX. So in this case, we'd render day for day 1. Again, it's index 1, it's the second one. But we probably don't want to start from 1. We probably want to start from 0. Let's switch this back to 0. Now again, I know that the whole, and again, the workshop points you in this direction, but if you think about it, focusing on this stuff, I bet you guys hit a lot of bugs when you added days and remove days and that sort of thing. So if we sort of focus on this now, we could iron this out. Also, just think about this from a testing perspective. You can always test this out and say, hey, look, I'm going to have my day picker, my trip planner, and tell it to render the day picker. And I should see when I render the day picker, this day ends up getting rendered, right? So you can sort of see that if you wanted to write some tests for this, you probably could. Also, what we're doing is we're sort of isolating our code into really small pieces. So let's actually add, do we have any buttons here for adding and removing days? We don't. Let's actually add those buttons. So on our trip over here, we've got our panel. Let's add a button class, ETN default, add day. And let's add another button, and this is going to be remove day. And let's actually give these IDs so we can access them. This will be add day. This will be remove day. And just for the sake of it, since this is removing a day, let's give this a warning. And one thing that's nice about this is that if you looked at this as a production site, you would have absolutely no way to know that I ended up using Bootstrap. I'm kidding. It's obvious that's Bootstrap. So now we get into something that's also kind of interesting, okay? Which is you need to wire up these buttons, okay? This is not something that's dynamic. These buttons are going to be on the page when the page ends up loading, okay? But one of the things, there's going to be certain buttons that we're going to want to initialize. This is one set of buttons we want to initialize. The other set of the buttons that are on the top, which are going to allow me to add items. So let's go over here and let's set these up. So what I'm going to do here is that when I end up calling my trip planner, which is going to be over here. So when I end up calling my trip planner, what I'm going to do when this thing ends up loading, I'm going to call a method called init. This is going to set up all of my event handlers. Okay? Again, just so I can not have a ton of my code in the constructor over here. And so I'm going to create this init method. By the way, it's looking for some semicolons here. Let me put these in. If you don't like that, you'll sometimes get these messages. I'm going to say globals. $sign is a global. Just make that error go away. And we'll go over here and we'll specify my init method. And this is going to be prototype init. So what do we want to do? We're going to have this date picker. Again, I always do this add day, remove. Actually, we'll do this. That's fine. Add day, remove. Remove day, remove. All right, just to see that I'm able to select what I think I'm going to select. Okay, both those go away. Again, one of the things that you have that is very important, if you were using document get element by ID and you tried to attach event handlers to it, you'd get an error if in fact, you know, you did document get element by ID and you tried to set a style on it, you'd get an error. With jQuery, if you don't get anything in your collection, there's no errors. It's just nothing happens. So the number of times that that I've had students say, "Hey, look, nothing's happening, but I have no errors. Something's wrong." It's like, well, are you selecting what you think you're selecting? That's always my first question. So let's actually add this in. And we're going to say, when you click on this, here's a case where we know that this is pointing to my button here. I don't really need that button, right? These buttons don't do, I know that in here, this is going to point to my button. I'm not doing anything with that button. What I want to do is I want to end up adding a day, okay? So one of the problems that I have here is that I've lost my context. Now, this is one where it's perfectly legitimate. There might be a way to change the context in a callback on a button. I wouldn't bother. I do feel that if you're clicking on a button, keep the context for the button. Maybe you want to do something with the button. Who knows? But if I say that equals this, then I could say this, add day. Thank you. That add day. Okay, so I have my add buttons here, right, which are going to be adding my days. And the other thing that I would like to be able to do here is that what I can do is I could specify, so when we end up adding a day, we know that our current index ends up changing. So I could say that current IDX, don't forget when we end up adding a day, it gives us back that index for the item that we just added. That's just how we ended up writing add day. And in this case, after we end up adding a day, then I could specify that render date picker. In which case, what should happen here, when I add a day, I get another day, and you can see that the days should be rendering here, okay? Right on the same token, remove a day. Well, for now, what we'll do is we're going to remove a day based upon what the current index is, okay? So day, we're going to use the splice method. And again, we've got a that and this problem, but we're going to say that dot days dot splice. Well, which one do you want to get rid of? That current IDX. How many do you want to get rid of? I want to get rid of one. Now I've modified days, and I'm going to say that render date picker.
Do you need to redefine what current IDX is?
No, in fact, I think that that's a very good question. So I think what I've done here, good call. I want to say that current IDX, for default, I'm going to set it to 0. Okay, go back to the first day. And so if I rerun this, I should be able to add days, and I should be able to remove a day. Now, one thing that, to sort of avoid this scenario where you don't have any days, you might want to just have some functionality here that says, if at.days.length is equal to 1, if you're on your last day, don't allow them to remove the last day. Any number of ways you could sort of handle this. So now you could add days and you could remove days, but you can't end up removing the last day, which again might be functionality that you want. Okay, so now we've got the ability to add days, we've got the ability to remove days, the user the ability to change it, right? So right now, we don't have any mechanism for moving between days, okay? Now this is one where these days are getting added dynamically. So it's not like I can access this by just going in and using IDs, because those IDs wouldn't even end up existing. So what I want to do is I want to use jQuery, and I want to do this in my init, and I want to go and I want to listen to, over here, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to say, hey, look, I have my date picker. When the date picker is clicked on, and in particular when the list item from the day is clicked on, I want to call this function. And what I want to be able to do here, just to sort of see what this ends up doing, I say console.log this, what this should tell me is that if I click on the day, it's going to tell me you have a list item. Again, nothing is really changing here, but I can click on these list items. And one of the things that's kind of cool with jQuery, that if you have an item that's in a collection, you wrap it, okay? Again, we're a tree structure, so if you're in a collection, jQuery allows you to get the index of what the item was that got clicked on. So now I can go over here, and this is going to be 0, and this is going to be 1. If I add a day, this is going to be 2, so on and so forth, right? So what I could do here is that when I end up clicking on a day, first of all, I want to make it the active day, right? So what I can do is I can say, this is going to be, in fact, we know that this is going to be my current index, right? Again, I need my that. That.current IDX is this day. Okay? I'm going to take all the siblings from this button, however many there are. I'm going to remove the class active from all the siblings. If I just did this, siblings should be, yes, is a method, thank you. So it's not a property, it's a method. Well, you guys are catching them all today. So if I just did this, I would end up, losing this. And what I want to be able to do is that I also want to be able to specify this dot add class active. So that when I do this, that becomes the active one, and I can click on the various days, right? So again, if you look at this, again, it's not that this is not it's not trivial, right? But you do have the ability to sort of build this out a little bit at a time. Okay. Again, we could have started with the select objects on the top if we wanted to, okay? But this is just a little bit, I think, a little bit easier to do. So now, once we end up doing that, then we could think about, hey, how do I go about, adding days? We could. Or we could actually be a little bit slicker and actually put some things in the 2 days that we have just to see that it's working, right? So one thing we could do is that we could go up here and for our days, let's go in and we'll do this. We'll say this dot days, this dot current IDX. We know that this is going to be this object. Let's just say hotels dot push, and we know we have attractions, okay? And we have on attractions we have hotels 0, and we'll say on the same token, all right, just to get some dummy data in here again without having to wire up that stuff on the top, just to get this to start working. And we could say, let's say restaurants and push and attractions, restaurants 1. Right, this shouldn't end up breaking anything. But what should happen here, and we could actually, if we wanted to, we could start with just the 1 day. And we're supposed to render day 0. So let's actually just see if we know what day 0 looks like. So when we go to render day, let's say day equals this dot days, this dot current IDX. And let's console log that day, which is a pretty simple object, right? Just an object made up of 3 properties. Okay, so if I look at this, my day is going to end up getting rendered, right? Here's my 1 restaurant, which is an activity. My activities don't have anything in them. My hotel has 1 object. Right, which has, here's the hotel, and I'm going to have 1 restaurant as well. Okay. So we know that what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to we want to be able to go and we want to be able to render the correct item. So really what we can do here is that we can end up looping over our day, and for every day that we have, we can end up adding this item to our result set here, which doesn't exist today. Let's actually create those drop downs because we are probably going to want to be able to find them. So let's go over and within our result set here, we're going to go in here and look at our page, which is our trip. So trip to go here. Let's say that we'll have an unordered list. Let's call this let's actually call this, we'll call this hotels. We'll call this day restaurants. And let's call this day activities. And let's give all of these a class of list group item. And let's actually just put an item in here. You know, this is list group. It'd be nice maybe if these were partials, right? But this is going to be our list group. And let's go over here and we'll say that this is going to be a li class list group item. And let's say this is foo. And this is going to be bar. Spaz. So let's just see what this looks like. So one thing we know is that when we end up rendering a day, we probably want to clear out all the items that are on that day, right? So we've got these trip hotels, we've got these trip activities. So one thing we could do here is if we go to our trip planner and we go to render the day, which is over here, we could say hotels, restaurants, activities for each. And let's call this category. Again, my starting thing is always to go in here, see if I can find what I'm looking for. Say $pound. And this is going to be, what do we call this? We called this day plus category. Remove. We should see those lists go. This is not what I want to do, but let's just see if that works. I always want to see if I can find what I'm looking for. Right, and they all go away.
One question on the, when you're kind of building up your stream, you know, the day plus category or whatever. But is that, I've had some issues with that in the past before. Sometimes I've had to make that into like a separate variable just before that, you know, concatenating all that stuff.
Then you're,
I wonder what issues I'm running into. I wonder if it's,
I don't know. I haven't run into that. I mean, usually if that happens, my guess maybe is that you're missing something when you're concatenating, and you think that you have to create a new variable, but it's actually when you pull it out there, you might have made a change.
yeah.
And then that's why it's working.
So that's pretty cool then to be able to build up.
Yeah, because again, and this has nothing to do with jQuery. This is just JavaScript, right? JavaScript is gonna, all it is concatenating a string, right? So now if I end up doing this, instead of doing that, I want to take each of these and I want to empty them. Okay, so we can do that. Now let's actually do something. So we have a little label here, right? So let's put we'll put a label here, maybe an H4. We'll say that this is going to be hotels. You can imagine, again, this is something you might want to do with a swig template. We're definitely repeating ourselves a lot. This is going to be restaurants. And this would be activities. So we can see that we have those, but we have nothing in them now. So now what we have to do is we've got to now add the items back. Okay. So one of the things that we have here is that now we can start to separate out this again. And one way we could do this is that we could end up running this loop again. Okay. We could end up running this loop again. And when we end up running this loop the second time, what we can do is we can then use that key in our day, okay, and then loop over those items and then add our items. So we can do the same thing again, but things will be a little bit different here. We're going to loop again over our categories. And let's say that we've got our, let's start by saying console.log. I have to tell you, I keep on going through this code where I want to get my current day by saying this.days, this.current IDX. Sure, it seems like maybe we have a method here. Current day. Which ends up returning this.days, this.current IDX. Now, one of the things that I could do here is I could get I've got my day over here. That's on, right, so I'm on render day. I could just say this.day equals this.current day. And so now for each of these activities, I could say items equals day, and this is going to be my category. Right, either it's going to have something or it won't. Console.log items. Right, so I've got one object, and no objects. Okay. Once I end up having those items, then I could end up saying items for each. And in this case, what I want to be able to do is each of these items is an item. I couldn't think of a good word for these things. Activity, maybe? I don't know. No, not activities. We have activities. Events I didn't want to use because event is a keyword.
I call them things.
Thing? Oh. Thing and item, it's a toss-up. Right? So I'm going to say, so what I want to be able to do is I want to say render item. Right? This is going to be my item. Now, I've got a little bit of a problem here because I don't really have an item. What I have is an ID, or what I should have. I probably do have an item. I don't want to have an item. Let's also assume, I apologize, I meant to do this before. When we end up getting these things, for whatever reason, they're just going to be IDs, because this will also help us out with our selectives. So let's say that we have a collection of these IDs, and let's actually just make sure that we didn't break anything here. This is our... No, I don't think so. I think when they come over the wire, I think they come over, underscore ID comes over as a string. Because I think when you do to JSON on it, it comes over as a string. Don't forget I'm on the client side now, not on the server side. So if I go over here and let's actually just look at this. I'm going to say console.log item. So here are my two IDs that I have here. Now, what I really want to be able to do is I want to be able to go and find that item so I could add it. So this is really not an ID. Let's rephrase this. This is going to be my IDs. And this is going to be an ID. IDs for each. I want to get an item here. So it would be nice if I could have some method, this dot find item by ID and category. Here's my ID, here's my category. Now, again, I've got this problem with this here. So one of the things that I think is going to make my life a little bit easier And when I go in here, I'm going to use that. Okay? So again, this method doesn't exist. I'm going to get an error here. So I need to find have a method here. Is going to be Tripplaner, prototype, find item by ID and category. I need the category too, because I've got these attractions. I have to know in which collection to look at. Here's my ID. Here's my category. And eventually I'm going to want to console log this item. I'll do this now. I'll just get undefined here because that's what ends up getting returned. A legal token, which is prototype. And this is going to be a function. Let me, in that case, put my semicolon here.
I think a legal token is when you don't have a medical card, and I think it's,
Wait, say that again? When you don't have what?
you don't have a medical card, then it's a legal token.
I got to think about it. These guys. All right.
Choking.
Toking, illegal toking.
Oh, I got it. Okay, all right. You kids with your jokes. You're nuts. All right, so what I want to be able to do here is I want to look at what collection I want to look in. So I'm going to say VAR, I'll say collection equals this attractions category. And then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to filter this collection, and I'll say item equals collection dot filter. And let's actually just make this even a little bit simpler here. Let's just do a return. Filter my collection. Well, it's item again. I know maybe that's a little confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to filter. I only expect to have one. So I'll say the first one. If I don't get anything, I've got a little bit of a problem here. But I want to return when the item's ID is equal to the ID that I passed in. This is going to allow me to actually find the item.
Why not do an index of?
What would my index of is not going to be that easy to do. Index of is going to work. What would I be matching? Index of works, let's say you have a list of strings and you have a string that you're looking for in the list. I've got a string of objects and I'm looking for an object based on the ID. So index of I don't think is going to help me.
Aren't you just storing IDs?
I'm storing IDs, but what I want is I have a collection of objects. And I want the object that corresponds with that ID. Right. I mean, you could. It could work if I had right.
You have to create a flat list.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we could actually do probably wouldn't. Nah. I mean, we want things in order. It'd be nice if we sort of had a hash with all our keys. Yeah. So right now at this point, I'm going to run into my. Luckily, I have my that over here. I could say that dot render item. And if I do that, not really going to help me. And let's actually go up here and let's start adding these methods. So we have render day. We could go over here. And again, also notice that there's not, for all these methods, there's not all that much that's really going on. Maybe 6 lines, maybe in a method, tops. And we'll call this render item, and we'll pass in an item. Now, I got a little bit of a problem here because I also want to be able to know the category of which list I'm going to be putting this item in. So if I do console.log item, what would really help me out is if each of my items had a category, okay, and they don't. Now, granted, I have the category and I can pass the category, but you know what? I'm in control of this page over here, right? So I'm in control of this. One of the things that I could do is when I end up going into this method, I can do it simple hotels for each. Let's do that a little bit different here. Attractions, hotels for each. Again, this is client side. And I could say hotel, category is hotel. Make my life a little bit easier. Hotel category equal to hotels. Do the same thing for restaurants.
At what point is this running? Is this before the DOM finishes loading?
Yes.
So if I'm adding new hotels,
How are you going to add hotels if the DOM is not finished loading?
well, after the DOM finishes loading though, when I add a new hotel, would it still get this? No, you don't.
You can't. How are you going to add? We have no way of adding new hotels, right? We have a list of hotels that exist. We have an.
Right, that's what I mean. When you go through to one of those, you know, something in the drop down, everything in the drop down is already going to have this then.
But let's cross that road when we get to it. It's a good question.
Eric, I have just a very quick question. So we have two states here, like we have a document, document ready in jQuery.
Mm-hmm.
But then we also have a map initialize,
Mm-hmm.
which initializes our whole object, right? But the map initialize one, actually, sorry, the document ready, that's just when the DOM is ready, right?
That's when everything is loaded, like all your script files and your DOM has
But
loaded.
not the result of the script file, right?
Not the result of the
Okay.
script files. So here we're going to have, this is not going to be hotel. This is going to be, let me fix this up. This is going to be restaurant. Just doing this to make my life a little bit easier. And I'm actually doing it so the drop-down list is going to get a little bit easier. So this is going to be restaurant. Wait, guys, is this going way too long? Are you guys dying?
No.
All right, we'll see how far we end up getting with this. And this is going to be activity. Activities. Right? So now, at least, when I'm getting ready to add these items, I can look at these items and see the category, and that's going to tell me what list to add it to. So, name this. We name our trip, right? This is day hotels. When we go to add this item, what we could do here is we could say, I'm going to create a list item. And this is going to be $sign list item. I'm going to add class. This is from Bootstrap list group item. Okay. And I'm going to say, I could break this. I could chain this if I want to, but there's also nothing wrong with me saying the HTML for this is going to be item.name. Now I just have to know what list to add it to. Well, I've got my $, pound, day, plus item, category, and list item. So now I've got these two list items showing up. Now, again, notice that I could almost tell you that I know that probably the most complicated part, I think one of the most more complicated parts, actually dealing with these up here. Notice I haven't even touched them yet. Okay? I'm assuming I have some data okay? And I'm just working with this, and I can set up my functionality to say, hey, look, assuming there's some data in there, I want the data to show up on my list. This is the equivalent of if you write an application and you can't test out your application until you have your insert pages working, right? It's great if you have some data. That's why we seed data to start out with. We would say, hey, look, get your listing pages to work. We know that those CRUD operations are going to be trickier to do. So get your listing to work. And in this case, once our listing ends up working, then we can actually even go a step further and say, not only can we end up adding this, but how do we go about removing from this list as well? You have a question, Andrew?
Yeah, just a general question. So when we are starting from the server side and passing information through, and then using something like Swig or J to render it into HTML, when we're on the client side already, are there any tools that make it a little bit nicer? I know we're using jQuery to kind of do that, but we're also writing little snippets.
No, it's a great question. The question is, are there client-side templating tools?
Yeah.
There are. So there are tools that are out there. There's something called Mustache that's pretty common. There's something, I think, another one called Handlebars. The fact is, I have less experience with these because, frankly, there might even be Swig that you could end up using on the client. But I have a little less experience because when you end up using any of these applications that are these frameworks have some templating engine built into them already, so you don't have to build it right off the bat. But what you're seeing is the idea of actually, it feels a little, by the way, it's a lot easier than the native DOM methods, but it's really painstaking to end up adding these DOM elements here, okay? Now, again, without even going in here, one of the things that I would like to be able to do is to delete these items when I end up clicking on them. Now, granted, you could have a button to delete them if you want to. I'm going to keep it simple. And what I'm going to do here is that, again, these things are dynamic. So what I'm going to do, just to sort of get this set up, we've got this init method here. And what I'm going to do in this init method is to loop over my categories, hotels. We could definitely see that this should be refactored at some point, right? We've got our, because just think about what happens. Hey, we added a new category. Oh man, I'm looping over those things 10 times in my code. You can imagine you'd want to pull that stuff out. In fact, I'm doing it on the client side and on the server side. So here, I'm going to say restaurants. I'll say activities. We sort of did this already, but this is going to be a for each. And what I want to do, I want to set up an event handler for this. Before I set up an event handler, let me actually make sure that I can find these things. And what I'm actually going to be looking for is going to be day plus category. And when I have my day plus my category, I want to be able to, let's say for now, remove, make these things go away. Actually, let's not remove them, let's just hide them so we don't get an error. Although I don't think we would get an error. Let's see. Yeah. So that's one thing with jQuery. We're trying to add things to something on the page that doesn't exist. You don't get an error, just nothing happens. But I see that I was able to select those items. What I want each of these items, I want to specify on click on a list item. And again, we can do our console.log this. So if we click on this item, it should tell us that we have a list item. Now, one thing that I don't have is I don't have my, I've got the name of my place. I really need to find out what item removing day. So one thing we could do here, I found this to be pretty helpful, was when I go and add these in my trip planner, so when I end up adding my items, I'm going to add 2 more attributes to each of these items that I add.
Hey, Eric, couldn't you just do index there?
I could do index, but don't forget, it's not, I don't need to just remove. Right, could I just do index there?
Because the display is a result of the data, so even if you like had a reorder function later, it would still, you have to reorder and then rerun.
Yeah, I might be able to do that. So I would just take, yes, that could work. So you're saying just remove it.
Get the index of the list item in, or of your collection.
I can, but I'm gonna do something a little bit different. And the reason why I'm gonna do it is that I might not be doing it in this example.
We didn't do it, I didn't do it this way. I did it like
Disable, once something gets, if you disable, maybe you disable something in the dropdown or hide it in the dropdown because it's added below, you might want to add it back in when you remove it, in which case you're going to want to have more information than just the name and the index. So what I'm going to do here is that when I end up adding this, I'm going to set 2 attributes. So one of the things you can do with jQuery is add an attribute. And when you're adding custom attributes by specification, you should prefix them with data dash. They're not real attributes. There's no, well, there is an ID, but this is the ID of my item that I'm looking at here. So what I'm going to set here is I'm going to take my items ID, and I'm going to also use a data attribute of my, I'm going to use category and say item category. Now all these can be is strings, okay? But what this gives me the ability to do, when I go to delete these, and I come back here in my init method, it's going to be down here on the bottom. Here's my init method. And I do console.log this. One of the things that I can do is I could specify, hey, look, ID equals this, and I could get the attribute, data ID. I could get the category, data category. And I could console.log ID, console.log category. So now I go over here. I can see the ID and the category. And you know that one of the things that I can get with the ID and category is that I have the ability to item equals, now again, my this is not available in here, but for a different reason, right? I'm on this click event, but I've got my that, find item by ID and category, ID category, console.log, and I'll get my actual item back. So here are these items. And so now what this is going to give me the ability to do is it's going to give me the ability to remove that item from the list, right? The list that I'm going to be looking at. So here we're going to have that dot days item dot category. You're right, we probably could get away with just using the index, which is kind of interesting. Let's actually do that. So IDX is going to be $ this dot index console log IDX. Right, so this is going to be 0, this is going to be 0. And what this gives me the ability to do is to go over here and say this, that, dot current day, right? That dot current day dot category splice from IDX 1. And the other thing that we probably want to do here is once we do that is remove this. So a quick test to see if this is working would be to remove and go to add a day and come back. Now, I think here is I think that the error is, let's just see when we're clicking on our day picker. So on our day picker, the one thing that we're not doing, which we should be doing, is rendering our day, right? So this is going to be that render day. So we can remove this. Guys got pretty happy. Something wasn't working, huh? I saw that. So once we have that, now again, the only sort of, there are other things to do. I mean, and again, we can sort of focus on, the other thing I'm not looking at all right now, which adds a bit of complexity to it, is the map. Okay? But we sort of know what we should do with the map. We know that when we end up changing days, we should clear the map, except for that one marker that we have. We know that every time we add an item, we should add it to the map and then change the bounds of our map so we see that that item ended up. We know that when we end up removing an item, okay, we should end up removing the corresponding marker, and we can end up doing that. But the next thing, let's actually set this up so we specify our what happens when we end up, let's wire up these buttons here so that we could wire these up so that when we end up doing this, they'll get added to the appropriate day, right? So what we're gonna have to do two things here when we do that. We're gonna have to find the current day, know the category, add the ID to the days collection, okay? And then we're gonna have to also specify that we wanna render the item that we end up finding, and it'll go into the correct list. So let's set these up. So these buttons, what I would do here is that these are gonna be under our views, and they're gonna be under our selector. So we've got this category chooser, and what I'm going to do with this button, I'm going to give each of these buttons, take a couple of shortcuts here. I'm going to give this an ID. I'm going to call this add, and this is going to be my category. So this is what I'm going to end up wiring up, and just to make this a little bit easier, I'm going to say data selector. This way I don't have to go and start traversing up the DOM to find the selector. And this is basically going to be this ID, which is dynamic. And so I'll go over here and paste this in. This is going to be my selector. I also know that if I want to select with this, just so I don't have to attach it, a pound sign above it. So this is going to be the ID, the corresponding selector for that button. Category button, and I'm in my Tripplaner. Again, I'm going to loop over my categories. This time, when I go in here, make sure I didn't break anything. So when I end up doing this, I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to, again, just so I could see that I could get started, my thing is I'm always going to do $ pound add plus category, remove. And what I want to do here is I want to, there's also an important thing here, okay? You have to know when you're going to be dealing with elements getting added dynamically and when you're not. These are not getting added dynamically. There's no on that I need to do here, okay? So here, we're going to say when you're clicked on, I'm going to have this button. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to say selector equals $this attribute data selector. I think that's what I called it. Let's see. And this is going to be, let's break this down into 2 steps. I'll call this selector ID. And I'll say selector equals $selector ID. Just to know if I got the right one, I'll say selector.hide. That means if I click on the button, the selector should go away. Again, if I didn't screw something up. That works, so I have the right selector. So the next thing I'll do is I'm going to look at a value, and I'll say ID equals selector. So in jQuery, there's a value property, and let's look at that ID. So I have an ID here, and what we can do here is I also put on my selector a data category. So this is going to be selector attribute data category. I guess I could have put it on my button as well. It doesn't really matter.
You already have it.
I might.
Right now.
I think I do. By closure, I do have it. But let's do it this way. And so I'll go over here. Let's just see that I could get my category. So that's the category, and I have this method to get my item. So I've got item, okay? Now again, I'm inside my button click, so I'm going to say that find item by ID and category. ID category, let's just see if we've got an item. So here we have this item, and now we could probably say, we're going to need to do 2 things here, okay? We're going to say that current day, so to get the current day, and we're going to get the current day, and we're going to get the category, and we're going to push to the category the item's ID. Now, when we do that, we could say that render item.
Question, is there any reason why you wouldn't push the actual item into the object?
Well, no, not really, but I'm thinking forward a little bit. When you end up getting your data from the database, and you're probably just going to be storing IDs. So I think, I can make the case and say it's more efficient, but I think it's more of just in terms of me sort of looking ahead.
Yeah, I think we ended up doing it similar when we were loading into our day objects, we were putting the actual
Object.
objects of each one of the hotels and the attractions.
Yeah.
You could have,
And then when you want to grab stuff from it, it's already there, you just say, thing.name, thing.
Right. It's another way you could do it.
the problem in the real world, you can have multiple hotels with the same name. Right?
Then if you're doing it by, you never want to find anything by name.
Mhm.
Never find it by name. It's not unique.
Yeah, like when we clicked, we looked over there, got the ID, and then found it,
Yeah.
and then stored that object. So that's the only difference.
Okay.
Storing objects.
Yeah, because I know in the past I have seen people where they're using names to find things, and that you don't want to do. So here, but it doesn't sound like that's what you did. It sounded like you did use the ID. So here I'm going to, now again, I would like to have some, it would be nice if in fact I couldn't do this, but I have a solution uploaded that it's a little bit tricky to, you don't think it's going to be tricky, but it is actually tricky to get that to work. So here we could add, we could remove. If we add a day and we go back, this stuff is still there. On our second day, we could add stuff, okay? The only other thing that we're gonna do here is, this is pretty much done. This should probably be dynamic based on the current day. So we could end up doing this pretty easily by going into our trip and specifying this is going to be day, and we'll say, we'll put this in a span, and we'll give it an ID of day number. Every time that we end up going in and rendering a day, so when we end up rendering a day, so when we go in here, we'll say $, and this is going to be pound, and this is going to be day number .html, and we'll say this current IDX, but it's going to be +1, right? So here's day 1 and day 2, go back and forth. So the mapping stuff's a little bit complicated. I'm going to cheat a little bit, okay? And the way that I'm going to cheat is that I've actually got a solution here, which we'll take a look at, and then we'll get it to work. So I'm going to create a new object here. I'm going to call this mapper. All right, let's actually take a look at it, see what it does, and then we'll implement it. So this is an object. Again, we could sort of think about, maybe we could end up testing this out as well. And what I'm trying to do here is just that mapping functionality and those markers are so specific to Google Maps. I'd like to maybe take it out and separate it out. The other stuff is definitely a lot more generic for a trip planner. So if we and the other thing is, we separate this out into different components, this might be a little bit easier to maintain. You don't have this huge file. So what I'm going to do is that when I create my mapper, I'm going to pass in a map and what I call my permanent point. Okay? So this is going to go in here, and I'm specifying my points as a hash. Okay? My permanent point, I'm giving it a key of perm. My map comes in here as a map. Okay? Let's look at the simple case of actually adding a marker, what adding a marker does. So when I tell my mapper to add a marker, I pass in an item. Okay? My item has a place, and my item has a location. Right? So when I end up adding, again, don't forget, when I end up adding an item to the list, when I end up rendering an item, right, I'm basically want to add a marker at the same time. So when I go to add a marker, I have my item here. I create a point with my locations. I create a marker And I'm also using my items category, so I have 3 different categories for restaurants, hotels, and activity. Okay? So now I have a point, I have a marker, and then the marker needs to be set to a map. The other thing that I want to do here, I want to be able to remove that marker. So I want to, when I end up removing an item, I want to remove that marker. So what I do, this is what my points object does. I use my points object, and I store the item's ID, and I point this marker to it. So now my points collection is really, think about it like my markers collection. I've got this markers collection that's on my map. And the other thing that I want to do is that every time I add something, I want that marker to show up in the map. So one of the things that you have is you have the ability to set your bounds. I did this as an underscore to basically say, hey, look, the user of this mapper should need to know about this. It's private. But so if I end up calling set bounds object, I end up looping over my the keys for my points. For each key, I end up extending the bounds, and then I tell the map I want it to fit this bound. So make sure that the map will expand and contract based on the points that you end up passing to. Okay? That's the ability to add a marker. When you go to remove a marker, this is what makes that map pretty helpful. So I go and I end up getting the marker based on the item's ID. So the way that you end up removing a marker from a map, one marker, is you take the marker and you set its map to null. The way the API works. And then I want to get it out of that points collection, deleting it from that points collection. And then I end up setting the bounds again. So that's the ability to remove a marker. When I end up wanting to basically clear all the markers out on my map, which is what I want to do when I end up switching days, I end up looping over the points, but if the key is permanent, I don't want to get rid of it. I want that to stay there, right? That's sort of, I always want that to be there. And then I just reassign my points to whatever I had before. And you probably refactor that out, and then I end up setting my bounds. So in order to use this, what I could do here, and again, this is going to be utilized by our Tripplaner, okay? It doesn't know about the Tripplaner knows about it. Tripplaner is going to rely on a mapper. And so now if I end up going to my views, and I go to my index, I'm going to pull in this JavaScript mapper. Frankly, the order doesn't matter because this is only going to happen when things load. Let's just make sure I don't get an error here. And let's test out some of this functionality. So whenever we end up going in, well, first thing I want to do is that I want to go into my Tripplaner. And I want to create a mapper. So I'll say this dot mapper equals new mapper. What am I passing in here? I'm going to pass my map in. I'll pass my marker in here. Right, nothing breaks. Here's my mapper, right? And so when in fact, so here's my map, here's my permanent marker. When I go in here and I end up adding an item, render item, right? So the item ends up getting rendered. And actually, so it's not only here. Okay, I got to be careful about this. So when I go to render an item, I think that this will work. Yeah, that's fine. So when I end up going to render an item, I'm going to say mapper, this dot mapper, add marker item. So these two markers should end up showing up. When I end up now, again, one problem that I'm going to run into is that if I end up adding a day, these markers are going to end up staying here. So every time that I end up going to render my, where did I end up doing this? I ended up doing this in, I rendered day, my day picker, but my rendering of the day. So every time a day ends up getting rendered, probably what I want to do is I want to go and I want to reset my map, right?
Is there a good reason we don't just have 3 maps or whatever one for generate a new map for each day?
I think that's got to be a big memory hog. I think it's more stuff that you need to manage. Although I don't know, you can make the case it's more of a pain to manage the points. Either way, I think.
Yeah.
So let's say this. We'll say this dot mapper reset. So if I end up adding a day, I still only get my permanent points. You see that there's a way of setting the zoom, which I could probably do here. But again, if I end up adding stuff here and adding stuff here, now let's just see what happens. Right, so that ends up looking pretty good. When I end up removing an item, I also want to remove it from the map. So where does an item get removed? Up over, again, this is going to be in my init. So when we end up this is when we are adding something, right? Let's see, where is that done? So when we end up rendering our items, this is going to be on our day. Yeah, when we go in to remove it. So here we have our item. We could say this dot mapper, remove item, remove marker, item. So you could end up adding things. Again, the one thing that I would probably do here, and I did it in the solution that I have up online, is that, you know, you might not want to let people add the same thing twice. It's kind of silly. But if you start removing things, you'll see that remove marker is undefined. Maybe I just called it remove.
I think you said this.
Okay, so right, so we're in here, right? Common thing that'll drive you crazy. But sort of we could test that out really fast by doing that, and it should end up disappearing from the map. So that's about the extent of this. Why don't we end up? We'll take a lunch break. I did. In fact, let me stop the